Hello hockey fans, today we begin a two-part video series looking at the career of a man whose skills on ice was only matched by his desire to win and his leadership skills. He had the respect of his teammates wherever he played, and always drove himself to go beyond his means many times in his career. His name is Lanny McDonald. Throughout his illustrious 16-year Hall of Fame career, he had ups and downs on and off the ice, unfairly dealt with backhanded sneaky politics, but his never-quit attitude is what kept him going from his start as a prospective rookie to the mustached wonder that became one of the most beloved players in the league. Lanny was also tough when he needed to be. Well, no, I'm not saying he dropped the gloves a lot, but he went on the ice fearless in any given game. For him, winning was what mattered. Getting the goal or setting up the assist or making sure an opposing forward is contained. That is what made Lanny great. So we take a look at part one of his career, the Leafs years. Lanny McDonald was born on February 16, 1953 in the town of Hanna, Alberta. He was the youngest of four children, idolizing his father Lorne, a farmer. McDonald learned to skate at the age of 5. He also grew up listening to Foster Hewitt broadcasting Leafs games on the radio. He was also worked as a stick boy for the community team, and he shared his father's devotion for his favorite team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. As a matter of fact, Lanny's middle name is King. This was after King Clancy, of course, the great Toronto Maple Leaf. By Lanny's teen years, he was making waves in Lethbridge. He got a chance to join the Medicine Hat Tigers of the WCHL at the age of 17. However, he wanted to complete high school and obtain his diploma. But he did join the Tigers eventually for the 1971-72 season. He scored 50 goals, 64 assists for 114 points. Then the following year, in 72-73, he had an incredible year, with 62 goals, 77 assists for 139 points. Lanny was a highly touted prospect going into the 1973 NHL draft at the age of 20. And on May 15, 1973, the draft took place. It's one of the greatest top 5 lineups ever. Taken first overall, Denny Potvin. Some dubbed him the next Bobby Orr, of course. But at number 4, Lanny McDonald was chosen to play for his favorite team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs just back in the 60s were a dynasty, winning 4 Stanley Cups in the span of 6 seasons, including 3 straight. But sadly, resident badmen Stafford Smythe and Harold Ballard, the team owners, well, they ruined everything. Stafford died, Harold lived. And, well, Harold Ballard was nothing much more than a money-grubbing, greedy, tyrant, miserable, bitter, racist, misogynist, vengeful, spiteful, convicted criminal, and downright very, very bad. And that was on his best of days. But of course, in public he put on that big smile and that pal-hal persona, haha. So resident ass-kissers such as media pundit Dick Beddoes kept him in a positive light. Lanny was joining a Leafs team that had fallen apart, but to his credit, general manager Jim Gregory hired a new coach in the great Hall of Famer Red Kelly, an icon both in Detroit and Toronto, and the only man to have 8 Stanley Cup rings without playing for Montreal. The Leafs had their fair share of talent on this team. Team captain Dave Keon was among one of the best of his time. They also had 18-year vet Norm Ullman. He could still go pretty well at this time as well. They also had Paul Henderson, the infamous 1972 Summit Series hero, the hard-working Ron Ellis, a young go-getter named Rick Kehoe. They also had another rookie who hoped they might add some depth to their defense, Börje Salming, a Swedish import, one of the first in the NHL. And of course, their star young 23-year-old forward, Darryl Sittler. Admiring his drive and determination, Red Kelly told Lanny that he made the main roster. On October 10, 1973, he played his first game and what a debut. Lanny assisted on 2 goals, one of which was on his childhood idols, Dave Keon. It was a sensational debut, however, that was cut short because after a hit from Rick Martin of the Buffalo Sabres, Lanny suffered a concussion and would miss the next game. He would return to action, however, shortly after. His first goal came about a week after his debut, assisted by, well, Dave Keon, and he scored it on Bunny LaRocque of the Montreal Canadiens. McDonald didn't have a huge scoring touch throughout the season, but he was well liked by his teammates because of his work ethic on the ice and all overall determination. Plus, playing alongside Dave Keon helped him a great deal. Soon enough, however, he was also playing on shifts with Sittler, and their chemistry was forming. McDonald had 14 goals and 16 assists for 30 points this rookie year, playing 70 games, as the Leafs had a winning record and clinched the playoffs. McDonald did finish in the top 10 among rookies, but Börje Salming actually fared better in that regard with 39 points. And unfortunately, he suffered an injury late in the year that sadly caused him to miss what would have been his first playoff series. The Leafs played the Big Bad Bruins, a team that still had Phil Esposito, Bobby Orr in peak form. And they didn't stand a chance, and the Leafs were swept out. Lanny's chemistry with Sittler, however, was ever present. He had the most assists on Lanny's goals, plus Lanny assisted on more of Sittler's goals than he did for anyone else, and collaborated the most on assist with defenseman Ian Turnbull. Lanny's rookie year, he showed a little spark, but maybe not what was hoped for. Regardless, something was there and people noticed. And it would also be the first record he set in his career. The only year he'd play without a mustache. There were some hopes that with their young talent mixed with veterans that the Leafs would emerge as a proper contender in 1974-75. And if Lanny would have a great sophomore year, well, that would remain to be seen. Red Kelly stayed on as coach in Toronto, but behind the scenes politics between our curmudgeonly friend Pal Hal and team captain Dave Keon, and to a lesser extent Norm Ullman, was starting to affect the team. Paul Henderson departed for the WHA that year as well, which in Ballard's eyes was seen as a Benedict Arnold level of treason if any player did that. Lanny's role was likely to increase, but he was still having trouble coming out of the starting blocks in some ways, which he still played an excellent defensive game up front, but he still wasn't providing all that much statistically, and by that I mean, well, what he was touted to do, that is, as a top prospect. He also missed 16 games due to injury, but still improved on his numbers from his rookie year, with 17 goals and 27 assists for 44 points in 64 games. But the internal problems of the team had to be affecting them on the ice as well. That was the story in Toronto back at this time. They finished 2 games below 500, but they were, however, able to squeak into the playoffs for the brand new preliminary round format. But facing the Leafs would be a daunting task. The Los Angeles Kings, who had their first 100-point season as a team ever. They were led by Mike Murphy, Bob Nevin, Butch Goring, Dan Maloney, Terry Harper, and all-star goaltender Rogie Vachon. These opening round series, however, were a best of 3, as Game 1 is a thrill ride. Down 2-1 with just a minute and a half to play, Ron Ellis scored to tie the game at 2, and we're off to overtime. Unfortunately for the Leafs, nearly halfway through the extra frame, Mike Murphy scores, and LA takes Game 1. In Toronto for Game 2, it's a thrilling back-and-forth battle, but we're off to overtime again. However, this time the Maple Leaf faithful erupts. Pal Hal actually has a real grin on his face as young Blaine Stoughton scored to even the series, heading back to the third and deciding game in Los Angeles. The Leafs' defense is on point, and goaltender Gord McRae is turning shots away. LA puts the pressure on late in the game as the Leafs hold a 2-1 lead, but time ticks down, and the Leafs pull off the biggest upset of these playoffs, eliminating the heavily favored Kings in a very tight-knit series. Lanny, however, sadly wasn't much of a factor. He was health pointless and was a -1. But next in the Leafs' way were the defending Stanley Cup champions, the Broad Street Bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers. Oh yes, they were all still there at this point. Moose DuPont, Dave the Hammer Schultz, Reggie the Rifle, Ed Van Imp, Rick McLeish, Billy Barber, and in net, Bernie Parent, and of course, Captain Bobby Clark. The Leafs went down 2-0 early in Game 1, but stormed back in the second period to take a 3-2 lead going into the third. But in the third, however, during the span of 2:40, goal, the Flyers take a 5-3 lead and ice it with a 6-3 win later on, a big heartbreaker for the boys in blue. It didn't get any better in Game 2. The Flyers' defense destroyed the Leafs and limited them to just 13 shots, all of which Bernie Parent stopped. The Flyers won the game 3-0 and had a 2-game series lead going to Toronto. But hey, great news! The Leafs actually have 31 shots in this game. And unfortunately, it's still Bernie Parent in goal, and he still stops every one of them for his second consecutive shutout, a 2-0 win, as the Leafs hadn't scored a goal since the second period of Game 1, and they're about to be swept. In Game 4, the Leafs show they are not quitters, as again, it's a seesaw game back and forth, and we're headed to overtime. But the impossible dream becomes a nightmare as less than 2 minutes in, DuPont scores, and the Flyers complete the sweep. As for poor Lanny, he comes up empty-handed again, and he was even worse with a -3 on this series, but to be fair, you can count on one hand how many Toronto players played well in this series, and well, Philly was just too damn good back then. Lanny's chemistry this year, however, was not so much with Sittler. As a matter of fact, they were more or less kept away from each other for the most part. But he did find magic with a man who would actually be a big part of his early career going forward, Errol Thompson. As the two of them, along with George Ferguson, formed a very formidable, hard-working line, and it showed in these numbers too. And it came up big for the Leafs in many games this season. Lanny, however, will likely be called upon to do more the following season, because more changes are on the way. They're going to hit the Leafs organization hard, and he'll have to take on a much more significant role. And it wasn't by any means a bad season for Lanny, but soon the team will be expecting a little bit more. And boy, would they sure as hell get it. Things were changing in Toronto going into the 1975-76 season as both Dave Keon and Norm Ullman departed for the dreaded WHA. Ron Ellis had also decided to retire. So going forward, Red Kelly and general manager Jim Gregory had to remold this young Leafs team. Lanny's role, with that news alone, just got even bigger, and it was time for him to break out. But it didn't happen right away. In Lanny's first 20 games that year, he had 9 points. But then something happened. Starting in late November going into December, he went on an absolute tear, 32 points in his next 20 games, including 2 4-point games against the Atlanta Flames on December 29th, and another against the North Stars later on, and also a 3-assist night against the Kansas City Scouts. Lanny was still working very well with Ferguson and Thompson, but as the season progressed, he and Thompson were put on the same line with Sittler. And on February 7, 1976, a historic night that many hockey fans look back upon fondly, Sittler set an NHL record that still stands to this day, 10 points in a single game, and Lanny was a big part of that night as well, as he was tied with Boreas Salming for second best on the team with 4 points on that very night. Earl Thompson was third best behind Sittler's big night, and while all three men's points were collaborated with Sittler, but Lanny's +7 that evening was tied with Sittler's mark that night as well. It truly showed the great chemistry they had. Lanny had quickly and suddenly evolved into one of the top wingers in the league. He had gone from being a simple fan favorite to becoming a Toronto celebrity with this big season. Fans respected his work ethic, his grit, his determination, and his natural skills on the wing. The Leafs weren't without their struggles, but improved upon their previous season and finished with a winning record, and again had clinched the playoffs. Lanny had a career year, as the third season was the charm. 37 goals and 56 assists for 93 points, and finished 14th in league scoring. An incredible year for a man who accomplished something that's like a badge of honor for many athletes who play in Toronto, being engraved in their culture. Lanny and the Leafs in the preliminary round would face the Pittsburgh Penguins, who at that point had two exciting young forwards in Pierre LaRouche and Silaps Jr., the latter of whom was the son of a Maple Leafs icon. Game 1 took place in Toronto. Lanny scored a goal set up by Sittler that would prove to be the game winner en route to a 4-1 win. However, Game 2 in Pittsburgh, Leafs goalie Wayne Thomas was bombarded with 48 shots, and the Leafs couldn't get a lot of momentum going. Despite Thomas's performance, they lost 2-0. And the third and deciding game would be in Toronto, and it was an easy win. Lanny scored the insurance marker in the third period to win 4-0 to take the series in all three games. Lanny had 2 goals and was a +1 in this series, as the Leafs were looking pretty good heading into the second round, as a mustache marvel finally broke out in the playoffs. But in their way for a second straight year, this time the 2-time defending Stanley Cup champion Philadelphia Flyers. Game 1, Reggie Leach opens the scoring, but our hero Lanny ties it 4 minutes later. It'd be the only goal, however, the Leafs would score the whole game, and they lose 4-1. Game 2, Bernie Parent is a wall for the Flyers, and try as he might, Wayne Thomas and the Leafs just can't overcome the odds, and the Flyers go up 3-0. Salming breaks the shutout, but it's too late. The Leafs drop a 3-1 loss. The series shifts to Toronto for Game 3. It's a fight-filled, penalty-filled game, and Lanny gets to assist, but the Leafs blow a 4-1 lead. They came out on top, 5-4 to stay in the series. Up 2-1 in the second period of Game 4, Lanny scores a nice individual power play effort to put the Leafs up 3-1. En route to a 4-3 win, the series is tied. However, back in Philly, the Leafs are decimated by a score of 7-1, a bad game from everyone up and down the roster, and Lanny was a -4. Game 6, they're back up against the wall, back at home, and the Leafs are dead focused, and Darryl Sittler, who hadn't scored a goal yet in the playoffs, scored 5 on that night. Lanny had 2 assists on the evening in a huge 8-5 win. We're off to Game 7. And however, despite a 2-1 lead after the first period, the Leafs fell apart and would lose 7-3. The Flyers move on. Lanny played well in some games, but the Leafs' defensive play was atrocious in some of those games as well. Despite a 6-point outing in the series, he was also a -7, tied for second worst on the team. Lanny's career year at that point saw him further develop a huge chemistry with Errol Thompson. Nobody assisted on more of Lanny's goals than Thompson. Sittler, however, was a close second. And Lanny also assisted on, get this, 27 of Thompson's 43 goals that year. That's 62.79%. Again, Sittler was second in that category as well. However, first in assist collaborations is Sittler. This line of talent is coming together in a huge way. Indeed, Lanny's year showed that he was going to be a star in the foreseeable future, and his status as a Toronto sports star was only starting to grow. He had career highs in every single category, and again was 14th in league scoring. He also had a career high +24, and also had 8 points in 10 playoff games. It was only about to get better. Back in 1972, the Summit Series had brought international hockey to a whole new spotlight in Canada. There was another Summit Series in 1974, and the showcase of it all was expanding. International hockey was becoming a whole new beast, hence the inception in 1976 of the first Canada Cup tournament, a showdown between 6 countries, pitting Canada, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Sweden, the United States, and Finland, all to face each other. The headlines of who would be selected for this team brought wide attention to the Canadian sports media. Lanny's breakout season was enough for Team Canada to take notice, and he was selected to the club along with teammate Daryl Sittler. Of course, Swedish imports Hammarström and Salming represented Sweden, giving the Leafs a great deal of representation in this tournament. Lanny had 2 assists in the whole tournament. However, one of them was on the game-winning overtime goal from Daryl Sittler to win the championship in overtime. Lanny had his first professional sports championship under his belt. It was a great way to start that 1976-77 season. This Leafs team was still growing, but winning the hearts of fans all across Toronto, Ontario, and their fans throughout Canada. Lanny was also a hero back home in Alberta to the many fans he had there. To begin the 1976-77 season, Lanny was on a tear, scoring a point in each of the first 8 games, including a hat-trick against the Philadelphia Flyers, 10 points overall. But the Leafs were slumping. They were just 2-5-3 in those first 10 games of the year. But Lanny continued to shine, and the Leafs were starting to win a few more games here and there. One of his big nights of the year came on December 1st, 1976, when he scored the second hat-trick of the year, third of his career, I might add, in a 4-point night in a win against the LA Kings. Also, the Leafs had one of the best power plays in the league that year, anchored by both Boreas Salming and Ian Turnbull on the blue line. Lanny was the one parking the goals in the net on the extra man advantage, adding a whole new dynamic to his game, something Red Kelly, as a coach, didn't get enough credit for. Lanny also deserves credit for something else, however. Errol Thompson, the man who helped Lanny evolve into a better forward and vice versa, was injured just a few games into this season. As a matter of fact, Thompson pretty much missed half the season. When he returned, however, their chemistry was still on point, but Lanny still had his good friend Daryl Sittler and others by his side, helping him evolve and further beyond. And for the first time in his career, Lanny was chosen to play in the 1977 NHL All-Star Game. Lanny had 2 goals in the game. Unfortunately for him, so did Rick Martin of the Sabres. And since one of them was the game winner with a 4-3 win with under 2 minutes to go, Martin was named the MVP, but Lanny was the second star of the game. By the All-Star break, the Leafs were 23-19-6 for 52 points. Not bad considering their sluggish start to the season. They surged on and forward, and their dangerous power play got them far. And Lanny himself was playing superb hockey. Unfortunately for the Leafs, they hit a bad slump at the end of the season, and were winless in their last 7 games of the year, but still made the playoffs. Lanny had 90 points, including a career-high 46 goals. He finished in the top 10 in scoring for the very first time, tied for 8th overall in points with teammate Daryl Sittler and Flyer star Bobby Clarke. Making his season even all the more impressive is that he led the league in power play goals with 16, and was amongst some of the league company in that top 5 category to boot. So now the Leafs had the playoffs to worry about, and in the opening round, their same opponent from the year prior, the Pittsburgh Penguins. Game 1 took place in the Igloo, and while tied 1-1 in the second period, Lanny was set up by Sittler, and it was 2-1 for the Leafs going into the third. Tiger Williams, the gritty man who could drop his gloves at the drop of a puck, also became ingrained in Toronto sports culture very early in his career. But he could also score a few goals here and there, and he did so in the third period, giving the Leafs a 2-goal lead. Pittsburgh's Mario Faubert, however, scored a power play goal, giving Pittsburgh a chance with 1:26 to go. However, Daryl Sittler, who had a 3-point night, iced it with an empty netter, and the Leafs take Game 1. The Leafs look for the Game 2 sweep at home, and the fans are rabid, but things get off to a bad start, as the Penguins take a 3-0 lead. Toronto plays much better in the second period, but still find themselves down 4-2 going into the third. The game, however, is still in reach. That dangerous Leafs power play goes from Lanny to Sittler to Turnbull, who scores to bring the Leafs within a goal, and Maple Leaf Gardens erupts when Salming ties the game just over 4 minutes later. However, later in the period, Pittsburgh's Greg Malone scores to restore their lead. The Leafs absolutely bombard goaltender Denny Herron, but it's not enough. They ice it with an empty netter with 37 seconds to play, and we're off to a third and deciding game in Pittsburgh. A loss like that can motivate a Warrior player. Well, Lanny is a Warrior, and he absolutely played the game of his life in Game 3. Toronto was up 2-1 in the second period, and Lanny had assists on both goals. And opportunities were there in the second, but neither team was capitalizing. The amazing trio of Williams, Sittler, and McDonald, this new line coming together, concluded with Lanny scoring to give them a 2-goal lead. 7 minutes later, Lanny scores again. This time Turnbull isn't on the play, and it was 4-1 Leafs. Pittsburgh got one back later on, and with 16 seconds left, Tiger, Sittler, Lanny, who scores an empty netter with 60 seconds to play, giving the Leafs the 5-2 win and winning the series 2-1. A 5-point night for Lanny McDonald, as he's in on every single Toronto goal that night, and the best night of his career thus far, and to boot, the Leafs are moving on. Overall, Lanny was only second to teammate Daryl Sittler in scoring for the whole series with 7 points. Turnbull, Salming, and Williams all came together with the 2-star scoring forwards to help win this one. However, awaiting them in the second round were the team they have battled in the last 2 seasons, the Philadelphia Flyers, who were hungry to get back on top after losing the Stanley Cup the year prior, ending their championship run. The memorable 7-game series from last season was still in the minds of Leafs fans and most definitely the players. This Flyers team still had many elements that made them successful. Despite losing the year prior, they still had 3 Stanley Cup Finals appearances in a row under their belt. Game 1 took place on Broad Street, but the Leafs shocked everyone. Sittler scores 4 minutes in. 3 minutes later, Tiger scores. Both goals having to do with the new hot line of Sittler, Williams, and Lanny, with Lanny assisting on both. Thompson scores a minute later after that. 3-0 Toronto. The Flyers, however, try to roar back, and the Leafs can't get anything more past Perron. The Flyers do eventually work to get 2 back, but the Leafs hang on for a shocking Game 1 win. Game 2 is even more shocking as the Leafs dominate the Flyers with a 4-1 win. Young goalie Mike Palmatier is fantastic in net for the Leafs, and Bernie Huron is pulled from a playoff game. Not only do the Leafs shock everyone by taking 2 games in Philly, but the fact that they were able to be the cause of something so rare with Bernie Huron is something to behold. Going back to Game 3 for Toronto, the fans are ecstatic, and the boys in blue, and what they had accomplished. And they looked great in Game 3 to start again. That devastating Leafs power play gives them a 2-0 lead after 1 period. But the Flyers roar back in the second to tie it. It's 2-2 after 2. But with 4:19 to go in the third period, Thompson, who hadn't seen much ice time in these playoffs, scores to give the Leafs a 3-2 lead. But the Gardens faithful is silence when Rick McLeish shocks him with 38 seconds to go, tying the game, sending it to overtime. And just 2:55 in, McLeish and his clutch abilities strike again. The Flyers take Game 3 in a huge heartbreaker. But no point in dwelling, as the Leafs could take a 3-1 series lead with a win in Game 4. And Lanny plays the other game of his life. The Flyers did hold a 1-0 lead going into the second period, and the Leafs faithful were silent. But early in the second, Lanny scores to tie it up. And just over 2 minutes later, he assists on a power play marker to Salming to give the Leafs a 2-1 lead. Reggie Leach, however, would tie it up. But Lanny scores his second goal of the game on the power play, and the Leafs carry a 3-2 lead going into the final frame. And then Sittler to Tiger to Lanny. Boom! 4-2 in the third period, and a hat trick for Lanny, the second of these playoffs. And then goal number 4 with just 7:16 to play. The Leafs lead 5-2. Lanny, 4 goals and an assist, another 5-point night. Oh, what a glorious day for the Leafs Nation. Short-handed goal by Bridgman. Well, okay. 5:49 to play. They can still hang on to... What? Tom Layden scores with 1:49 to play. Okay, come on, Leafs. You have a 5-4 lead, and just 16 seconds later, Bobby Clark scores and that game is tied? What the f***? Yes, Leafs faithful, your team wasn't just notorious for collapses in 2013. It was happening 36 years before that. But hey, we still have overtime, and yeah, that pretty much ends the same way the infamous 2013 game did. Just 50 seconds left in overtime, the Flyers win and tie the series. Lanny, despite an epic performance, likely hung his head with the rest of the team afterwards. 2 consecutive late game collapses, the second much worse than the first. Now we're going back to Philly with the series tied. The Leafs have no spirit in Game 5, even though Mike Palmentier was sensational between the pipes. But it just took 2 goals by Reggie Leach for the Flyers to take a 2-0 win and head back to Toronto with a chance to take this series. The Flyers' defense is giving the Leafs a terrible time in Game 6, but they do strike first on the power play as Turnbull scores, and the Leafs carry that goal to a 1-0 lead after the first period. In the second, Clark ties the game for Philly, but just 3 minutes later, our hero scores, and the lead is restored. But the Flyers score another, it's 2-2 after 2. Just over 5 minutes into the third, however, Tiger to Sittler to Lanny, his second goal of the game and his 6th goal in 3 games. The Leafs lead again 3-2. But just over 2 minutes later, McLeish ties it with a power play marker of his own. It's 3-3 late in the game, and the atmosphere is tense, but with 2:38 to play, and Jimmy Watson of the Flyers scores to put them up 4-3. The Leafs press and press and press, but they can't get any chances, and the clock ticks down on them and their seasons. 3 straight losses to the Flyers in 3 playoff years. A 2-game series lead with just 38 seconds left, on the verge of taking a 3-0 series lead, only to lose in overtime. They lost a 3-goal lead late in Game 4 to lose in overtime again. A lifeless Game 5, and they blew another third-period lead in Game 6. Someone's head is going to roll because of this, and well, it's not Lanny, but it is head coach Red Kelly. He is no longer the team's bench boss at season's end. Lanny played superbly, including his 5-point game in the epic Game 4, but still the end tarnishes that just a little bit. Lanny was even second behind Sittler in playoff scoring at this point in the entire league as well. They had 10 points in the entire series, tied for second best with Flyers' Bob Daly and only behind Sittler. As a matter of fact, come playoffs end, Lanny and Sittler are both still in the top 5 amongst playoff scorers, with Lanny indeed rounding it out at number 5. Yes, indeed, everyone wonders what could have been, what should have been. Well, I can definitely tell you Montreal would have kicked their asses regardless. Call me biased all you want, but a team that goes 60 wins, 8 losses, and 12 ties isn't losing to anyone. Lanny's career year was the rise of the Leafs power play, and his chemistry with Sittler was sky high, as Darryl assisted on nearly half of Lanny's goals that year. In turn, he assisted on 15 of 38 Sittler goals. Better than anyone on the team. They even collaborated together on 13 assists. Indeed, they collaborated on a total of 51 goals that year, one way or another, just over a sixth of the Leafs' goals scored overall that year. An incredible year for Lanny McDonald. It started with a Canada Cup championship, and then 46 goals, a career high I might add, 44 assists for 90 points, tied for 8th in league scoring, finishing in the top 10 for the very first time. He led the league in power play goals, was a plus 12. He was 5th in playoff scoring and had 2 hat-tricks and 2 5-playoff point games. He played in his first NHL All-Star game, and even better, he was selected as a second-team All-Star for the very first time. An incredible year for Lanny. Going into the 1977-78 season, this Leafs team was hoping to progress further beyond simply being a playoff team who could win a preliminary series every year, but never beat the next team they faced. A new coach was brought in by the name of Roger Nielsen. Nielsen had success as the head coach for a decade of the Peterborough Petes junior hockey team, and now was venturing into the pros. He was unique, different, eccentric, had the type of strategies that players or even other coaches never heard of, and many wondered if he could be the guy to make the change. And there were other changes in Toronto. Earl Thompson would be traded during the season, and Ron Ellis came out of retirement. And while Nielsen was deemed to be, again, overly eccentric, be it his choice of wardrobe or style of coaching, that is, these players were responding to him. His unique approach just seemed to be what the team needed. Lanny was playing as well as ever. He had a hat-trick against the Detroit Red Wings early in the season, and later December had back-to-back 4-point games against Chicago and St. Louis at home. Chance of Lanny would fill arenas constantly at this point, as his headlined name was all over the papers. His popularity in Toronto had skyrocketed. He was selected to take part in his second straight NHL All-Star game, and shortly after the All-Star break, he had another 4-point game in Atlanta. And he would also do so again in Pittsburgh on March the 12th. Lanny would finish the year with a career-high 47 goals and added 40 assists for 87 points. Who knows, he may have made 50 goals, but he did miss 6 games that year, but he still finished tied for 10th in league scoring. He was also a career high plus 34. The Leafs had a huge year themselves. Whatever Nielsen was doing, it was working. A record of 41, 29, and 10 for 92 points. Their first 40-win season since 1950-51. Their first 90-point season since 1960-61. The Leafs actually looked like a threat in the playoffs, but some weren't being given much of a chance of members of the Canadian sports media. However, the LA Kings were a breeze in the preliminary round. The Leafs were the heavy favorites in this series, of course, with wins of 7-3 at home and 4-0 in LA. They gave the Leafs an easy 2-game sweep. But winning the preliminary round again was nothing new. Lanny had a point a game, and for the Leafs, probably the biggest playoff cakewalk they had in years. But nobody was giving them a chance at all against the New York Islanders, the team that many analysts and pundits at the time were saying will be the team that takes the mantle from the Montreal Canadiens. They had a great deal of young, red-hot talent. Denny Potvin, Brian Trottier, Rookie of the Year Mike Bossy, who set an NHL record for goals by a rookie with 53, Clark Gillies, Bob Nystrom, Billy Harris, Stefan Persson, Ed Westfall, and the most dangerous goaltending tandem in the game, Batlin Billy Smith and Chico Resch. Game 1 was a disastrous night for Toronto. The Isles jumped out to a 3-0 lead in the first period and never looked back. While Lanny set up Sittler to break the shutout, the Leafs dropped Game 1 4-1. Game 2, however, the Leafs came out fighting, and Ian Turnbull scored in the power play just over 13 minutes into the game. But just over 3 minutes later, however, Gillies scored a power play goal of his own, and the game was tied 1-1 after 1. It was still 1-1 after 2, as both teams were playing a very tight-knit game, which did see a lot of fighting, a lot of penalties, a lot of scraps, you name it. It's getting intense in the third period, fight after fight, misconduct after misconduct. The Isles took the lead on a Bob Bourne goal, but halfway through the frame, George Ferguson scores a tie at 2-2, and it would remain that way to the end of regulation, and we're up to overtime. However, it was Mike Bossy who would be the hero, and the Islanders take a 2-0 series lead, heading to Toronto. In Game 3, however, the Leafs defense came together as their fans still had faith. Goals by Ron Ellis and Ian Turnbull was all they needed. Palmatier stopped 19 shots for the shutout, and the Leafs were still in this series with a 2-0 win. In Game 4, the fists were flying and the game was even more intense. The Leafs, however, overall looked even better, with a 3-1 win, and the series is now tied 2-2, heading back to the island. Unfortunately, the Leafs will be out with Boreas Salming for the foreseeable future with an eye injury, and it's not looking good. In Game 5, both Palmatier and Resch are great in net, as each team's defense is playing well to boot. After a scoreless first, Ian Turnbull was the first to strike as the Leafs drew first blood, but Denny Potvin would tie the game later in the period. After a scoreless third period, meant we're off to overtime again. But again, one of the best clutch playoff performers in the history of the game, Bobby Nystrom, scores the OT winner just over 8 minutes in. The Islanders now have the Leafs backs against the wall heading to Toronto for Game 6. But again, the Leafs faithful doesn't lose faith. Lanny, however, has taken some harsh criticism over how he's played in this series. He just has 1 assist in 5 games going into Game 6. Well, Lanny answered his critics in a huge way. Sittler scored a goal just 2:49 into the game and less than a minute on the power play. Lanny set up Jack Veliquet to put up the Leafs 2-0. Then later on in the period, Lanny scored his first goal of the series at power play marker, giving the Leafs a 3-0 lead in the game. After 2 periods, it was 5-0, and the Islanders would get a couple back, but the damage was done. We're headed to Game 7. Well, Game 6 was another one where the fists were flying. Game 7 was a little more disciplined. Well, there were still quite a few penalties, but nonetheless, both teams were focused on what the task at hand was. But it's all come down to this. Each team has only won at home. We'll see how this plays into this game. Early in the first period, Denny Potvin makes a great individual effort, and the Isles are up 1-0 after 1. Ian Turnbull, who no doubt had been the Leafs playoff MVP at this point, scored to tie it in the second. Neither team would give anything up in the third period, and we're off to the third overtime of these playoffs in this series, and the Isles have won both previous extra sessions. However, just 4 minutes into the extra frame, it happened. Yes, Lanny McDonald scored the most infamous goal of his career, the goal that turned him from a superstar into a borderline demigod in Toronto, a tried and true icon, a goal that many Leaf fans around at that time still recall fondly to this day, and has become one of the most infamous moments in the team's history. And because of that goal, the Leafs are on to the semifinals for the first time since they won the Cup in 1967. Lanny did have a rough series to start, but his performance in Game 6 and legacy-making series overtime goal in Game 7 silenced the naysayers. The Leafs were off to face their biggest rival in the semifinals, the two-time defending Stanley Cup champion, Montreal Canadiens. The Habs were in the middle of a dynasty, 2 cups in a row, and a team just exploding with talent. Lemaire, Schutt, Gainey, Robinson, Savard, Lapointe, Dryden, coached by Scotty Bowman, and of course superstar right winger Guy Lafleur. In Game 1, Palmateer was bombarded and Montreal's defense just completely destroyed the Leafs en route to a 5-2 win. The Leafs looked much better in Game 2, even erasing Montreal's 2-0 lead by tying it in the second. But Lafleur's power play marker late in the second put the Habs at 3-2, and their defense went to work and Dryden made some big saves as the Habs took a 2-0 series lead. The Leafs are humiliated on their home ice for Game 3, 6-1 as Lafleur, Schutt, and Robinson are on unstoppable force. And in Game 4, Dryden scoops up a 23-save shutout en route to a 2-0 Habs win and a series sweep. I meant what I said. Literally nobody could stop the Habs at this point. The Leafs as a whole were squashed, and that included Lanny, just 1 assist and an abysmal -5, tied with Turnbull for worst in the series. Despite this, the Leafs had a lot to be proud of this year, and had progressed at a higher level with Roger Neilson as their coach. Lanny's numbers showed that again that he and Sittler were a force to be reckoned with. Sittler assisted on 29 of 47 Lanny goals, that's 61.7%. Lanny also assists on 17 of Sittler's goals, and they collaborated on 14 assists together as well. They worked together on 60 goals, that's over a fifth of the Leafs' goals that year. Lanny had another excellent year, a career high in goals with 47, tied for 10th in league scoring, a career high plus 34 as well. Played in his second consecutive NHL All-Star game, helped the Leafs to their first 90-plus point season in years, their first 40-plus win season in 27 years. He also scored the most infamous goal of his career to clinch Game 7 to put the Leafs in their first semifinal in 11 years. Going into the 1978-79 season, there were high hopes for the Leafs. They had many talented forwards, a great power play, even a good penalty kill to boot. The Leafs were quite complete at all ends, it seemed. Well, at least that's what it seemed on the surface. The relationship between general manager Jim Gregory and Harold Ballard, however, was deteriorating, and the Leafs were about to take a bit of a step back this season. Lanny, however, started off the season right in just the second game of the year. His success against the Islanders continued with a 4-point night. Lanny, as usual, was playing hard game in and game out, so were many others on the team. But over time, they just seemed to lose focus and were unable to finish games. Patience was growing thin from Pal Hal's camp with both Gregory and Coach Nielsen. In lieu of the NHL All-Star Game that year, and with international hockey still growing, the NHL implemented the Challenge Cup, a 3-game series where All-Stars from the NHL would face off against the Soviet national team. Lanny was selected to play, but sadly did not register a single point in the 3-game series, which the NHL would lose. But things were getting bad come March. After a loss on March 1, 1979 to the Montreal Canadiens, that put the Leafs on a 5-game losing streak. After the loss, journalist and resident Ballard bootlicker Dick Beddoes caught up with Ballard, who was in Montreal that night, to which he informed that Roger Neilson would be fired. Well, the hoopla and usual Pal Hal bull followed, but guess what? He couldn't find a damn replacement. Nobody could. Many of the Leafs players knew that it wasn't Roger's fault how they were playing. So a group of them met with Ballard, and the voice of reason was actually Tiger Williams. Well, long story short, Nielsen was given his job back, and Ballard wanted him to wear a paper bag on his head for some huge mystery reveal for a big publicity stunt. Oh, that Harold! Thankfully, Nielsen could see through the idiocy of it all, and didn't do it. The funny thing was, during his firing, he never missed a single game. The Leafs actually went on to win 5 in a row after that. They finished the season pretty strong, and finished with a record slightly above 500, and were again in the playoffs. Lanny had 43 goals and 42 assists for 85 points, his third consecutive 40-goal season. In the preliminary round, the Leafs would face the Atlanta Flames, a team who got good pretty quick right after they entered the league in the 72-73 season, but unfortunately were just unable to get past a certain point in the playoffs. This team had talents such as Guy Chouinard and Bob McMillan, who both had career years. Also had Jean Pronovo, Eric Vale, Bill Clement, Brad Marsh, and goaltender Dan Bouchard. Game 1 took place in Atlanta and was memorable for everything that took place in the second period. Walt McKechnie scored 2 goals for the Leafs to take a 2-0 lead. Pronovo did score later in the period to keep the Flames in it. However, with less than a minute to go in the period, a bench-clearing brawl ensued in 8 game misconducts on both teams combined. And oddly enough, Lanny was one of the very few not to receive even a single penalty minute in this game. As a matter of fact, in the third period, many of the players who were ejected from the game were watching in their suits. Either way, Palmatier was excellent in net and at least hung on to a 2-1 win. It was tense for Game 2 in Toronto, and yes, there were some scraps, but nothing even close to matching the chaos in the previous game. Pat Boutet and Daryl Sittler put on a show, and the Leafs beat the Flames for the upset and 2-game sweep. Lanny, however, wasn't overly effective on the score sheet, but was still a +2 in the end. However, awaiting them in the next round was the very team that swept them out the prior year, the now 3-time defending Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens. Game 1, Lanny scored midway through the first period to put the Leafs up 1-0 after 1. And then Dan Maloney scored early in the second to go up 2-0, but the Habs destroyed the Leafs after that. While the Leafs did pressure Dryden in net, it wasn't enough. Palmatier was also pressured and succumbed to it. The Habs take Game 1 as Lemaire and Lafleur are unstoppable in their 5-2 win. It gets no better in Game 2 for the Leafs. Lafleur, Lemaire, Gagner, Robinson are brilliant. Dryden is fantastic in net. And while Lanny breaks Dryden's shutout bid in Game 1, in the game with just 17 seconds to go, the Leafs lose 5-1. The series shifts to Toronto, and this time the Leafs are a lot more focused and determined. And while Montreal led 1-0 with just 3 minutes into the game, the Leafs score a huge power play goal, and it comes up huge 2 minutes later as Lanny sets up Sittler. Then 3 minutes later, Lanny scores the goal-ahead marker to put the Leafs up 2-1 after 1. But the Habs get right back in the second, as Robinson and Lemaire score just over a minute and a half apart as 3-2 after 2. And with 2:20 to go, Montreal could take it, but Sittler, with a great individual effort, ties it, and we're off to overtime. Palmatier and Dryden are fantastic in the extra frame, so much so overtime solves nothing. We're off to double overtime. Just over 5 minutes in, however, to the second extra period, little-used Cam Connor scores to now give the Habs a 3-0 series lead. In Game 4, however, the Leafs refused to die, as even after being down 4-0, it didn't destroy their resolve. They roared back to tie it, and we're off to another overtime. But it only takes one period this time, just over 4 minutes in, Larry Robinson scores to win the series for the Habs and complete the sweep. There's nothing you can really say here. The Leafs bombarded Dryden most of the series, but he played some of the last great hockey of his Hall of Fame career. That, and again, the Habs were just too damn good. Lanny and Sittler were again a lethal tandem that year. Also, Tiger Williams had become a huge part of that line, giving it toughness and aggression and scoring here and there as well. Lanny McDonald finished his third consecutive 40-goal season, and his 85 points were tied with 15th best in the league. He was selected to play in the Challenge Cup to boot. It wasn't his most accomplished season, but Lanny was a well-established hero in Toronto after 6 seasons, which goes a long way in etching a legacy. Nielsen would actually be fired for real at the end of the season, and Jim Gregory was also shown the door after 10 years of being a Leafs GM. Apparently, however, Harold the Coward Ballard allegedly never told him, and he only found out he was fired when he was offered the job as head of central scouting for the NHL. The ever-popular Roger Nielsen being fired was not a good move in the eyes of the players. So heading towards the 1980s, things were changing. The league was continuously expanding teams, and now 4 teams in the WHA were entering the league. Ballard, however, felt the game was just getting too soft, and he wanted a new regime to rule with an iron fist. That, of course, would be new general manager, Punch Imlach. Well, actually, he's not so new, really. He was the man and the mind behind the Leafs' great success of the 1960s as their coach and general manager. He was no stranger to success. 4 Stanley Cup rings says a lot. He also helped mold the Buffalo Sabres since their early inception in 1970, and in a few years they were Cup contenders. He did this along with head coach Floyd Smith at that time, who was now the head coach of the Leafs as part of this package. Indeed, Imlach was known as a tyrant, even breaking down players to the point of exhaustion and, well, mental breakdowns, just as Frank Mahovlich. However, he coached the style the game was known for back then, a very no-nonsense approach and toughness. He was going to bring back a winning tradition to Toronto, by golly, as was Smith. Everybody was hoping for the Leafs to have the prospectful season like they had in 1977-78, but that became apparent pretty quick it wasn't going to happen. Imlach was still a tyrant lost in a different time. He implemented dress codes, curfews, rules about drinking. I guess the way he felt he could bring success to the team is to try to bring them back to 1964. Sadly, he didn't have a literal time machine, as that was the only way that was going to happen. Lenny has said in his 1986 biography, however, his autobiography that is, that it was apparent real quick that head coach Floyd Smith was a puppet of Imlach's. That's why he was hired. And there were rumblings this is pretty much how it was back in Buffalo to boot. Lenny was entering his 7th season in the league, all with the Leafs, and he and other players were trying to make a go of it. The Leafs were playing pretty average and inconsistently maintaining a .500 record or a little bit above and below. For the first time, however, on November 11, 1979, Lanny met Gretzky. Lanny was pointless in a -1, while Gretzky had 2 assists, but the Leafs won the game 6-3. Lanny was having trouble finding his groove in some games, but the team as a whole was faltering. Really wasn't his fault or any individual's fault. Well, okay, maybe not on the ice, but the relationship between Sittler and Ballard was disintegrating. Almost nobody liked Imlach as GM, but Sittler's disdain was visible to both the villains up above. They wanted Sittler gone. He had a no-trade clause, however, in his contract, so they decided, like two morons sharing a brain, to hit him where it hurts. On December 27, 1979, the Leafs played a game against the Buffalo Sabres. It was a 5-3 loss on the road. The Leafs' 3rd loss in a row, as a matter of fact. Lanny went pointless and was a -1. It would be the last game he'd ever play in a Leafs uniform. As the decade of the 1980s approached, Lanny was called to the office of general manager Punch Imlach. He was informed he was being traded, along with defenseman Joel Quenneville, to the Colorado Rockies, the worst team in the NHL and the league's biggest laughingstock. When a very shocked and heartbroken Lanny asked who he was being traded for, he was told it was, quote, none of his business. Oh yes, because he's totally not going to find out, you fedora-wearing. So yes, to get to Sittler, they traded his best friend. And a man who, along with Sittler, has been the top player on the team for the last 5 seasons. Oh, that Imlach, such a genius. That'll show Sittler. Haha. The trade was made official on December 29, 1979. Lanny McDonald, along with Joel Quenneville, going to the Colorado Rockies for forward Pat Hickey and power forward Will Paymont, who had been the Rockies' best player for quite some time. A trade at a spite. How pathetic. It was met with a huge outcry from Leaf fans, and rightfully so as soon as it hit media outlets. So much so that there was a vocal group protesting outside on Maple Leaf Gardens, calling for the heads of Ballard and Imlach. I think it was underestimated just how Lanny was really loved in that town. He was seen as a working-class hero of the club, a farm boy from Alberta, becoming a star in Toronto. The trade was a slap. Actually, no, scratch that. A spit in the face of everyone who was a fan of the Leafs, Lanny's teammates, especially Sittler, and of course, and above all, Lanny himself as well as his family. His wife was pregnant at the time of the trade, and they had built a really good life in Toronto. And as good as Paymont was at the time, he was no Lanny, far from it. His last season in Toronto saw him score 30 points. He didn't have many numbers with Sittler, but did work well with 2 men he did have great chemistry with during his time in Toronto, Borean Salming and Tiger Williams. Williams would also be traded that season. Also, Walt McKechnie was in on a third of Lanny's goals, as was Salming. Lanny's last season in Toronto were not looked back fondly. He did have 30 points and 35 games, but was a -1. The only time in Toronto he finished in the minus. 7 seasons, a tried and true warrior. Heart and soul of a lion out there, ferocious yet disciplined. Passion for the game, wanted to make a difference on the score sheet in any way he could. Traded out of pure spite. So now Lanny was off to Denver to play for the Colorado Rockies, a team that was conceived as the Kansas City Scouts in 1974. They lasted 2 years before moving to Denver, becoming the Colorado Rockies. Since entering the league, they made the playoffs once due to just being the best of the worst. In 1974-75 to the 1978-79 season, the team amassed a record of 81, 249, and 70. The most wins they amassed in a season was 20. They were run by Ray Miron, who gave the team no direction and had a crappy player development system. They were coached by the great Don Cherry. Yes, that Don Cherry. The team was so bad that even he couldn't get much out of them. The Rockies were 11-20-3 when Lanny joined them. He played his first game with them the day the trade was announced, December 29, 1979. A home game against the Philadelphia Flyers. The Rockies were down 3-0, and midway through the third period, the Rockies broke the shutout on a Rennie Robert goal, which Lanny had assisted on. The Rockies got one more but would lose 3-2. In the next game, a New Year's Eve win over the Detroit Red Wings, Lanny had 2 goals. His play had not suffered despite his circumstances. Just goes to show how resilient he really was. Lanny was playing pretty well. The Rockies, however, were still a hopeless bunch. And on February 19th, however, they found themselves on a 10-game winless streak, facing once again the best team in the league that year, the Philadelphia Flyers. The Flyers took a 1-0 lead, but Lanny assisted on a Rennie Robert goal tying the game, and then would proceed to score a goal of his own, giving the Rockies the lead. They were up 4-1 in the second period, but Kenny Linsman of the Flyers scored 2 goals to close the gap to 4-3. However, on the power play, Lanny scored his 30th goal of the year and second of the game to give the Rockies a 5-3 lead. Reggie Lee scored again to close the gap, but Lanny and Robert sent out Jack Veliquet to give them a 6-4 lead. It resulted in a monster upset, an 8-6 win, a 4-point night for Lanny. It would be the moment of the year for the Rockies, and pretty much one of the greatest moments in that team's sad, sad history. This would be as good as it would get indeed. The Rockies finished 19, 48, and 13. Good enough for dead last in the league. It was the first time in Lanny's career he'd missed the playoffs. During his time in Denver, Lanny scored 25 goals and 20 assists for 45 points in 46 games. In Denver, Lanny excelled with defenseman Mike McEwen, playing many shifts with him, as well as Rennie Robert, the former All-Star in Buffalo. Both men were also traded that year by their former teams, much like Lanny was. I mean, hey, can't fault Ray Marin too much. He was trying to make moves, but sadly it just never changed anything. In Denver, Lanny went from being a part of a group that was a big fish taking up an entire lake to being the big fish in a small pond. His numbers were still good, but obviously not used to what we're seeing from him. But not all of that, well actually barely any of it, is all down to him. He had 45 points in 46 games, was a career worst minus 15. But on a team like this, that's probably among one of the best plus-minus numbers. Either way, there was one thing in Denver that Lanny had with his teammates that he had in Toronto, but one thing in common, and that was the respect of his teammates. Indeed, Lanny's dream turned into a nightmare. All he wanted to do was be a Maple Leaf his whole life, and all because he wanted to spite his best friend. He was put in the middle by 2 very bitter old men sharing a brain that was clearly not functioning properly. The Leafs were 15, 16, and 4 when Lanny was traded. Since his departure, they went 20, 24, and 1. Not all that much better, despite how well Will Paymont played after his arrival in Toronto. Before the trade, Lanny was averaging nearly 0.9 points a game, but after his trade to Colorado, he was closer to a point a game. As for Will Paymont, the principal part of the trade along with Lanny, before he went to Toronto, he was actually slumping somewhat, averaging just 0.76 points a game, but after he went to Toronto, went on a tear, and he would end up averaging 1.14 points a game in the Leafs uniform. How did Sittler fare, however, without his longtime best friend and teammate, and line-mate to boot? He was averaging nearly a point a game before the trade, but broke out and went on a tear later on and averaged 1.4 points a game. Despite their losing record, the Leafs did get into the playoffs, but they were swept out by the Minnesota North Stars. So Toronto totally wins this trade, right? Lanny was the problem all along. Well done, Punch! Well done, pal Hal! Yeah, right. Ugh. So Lanny's tumultuous year comes to an end. He does reach 40 goals, however, for the 4th straight year, and after 7 seasons, he is traded out of spite to the worst team in the league. He continues to produce, but his talents seem to be going to waste somewhat. He fails to average a point a game for the first time since his sophomore year, is a career worst minus 16, and misses the playoffs for the very first time. Lanny accomplished a great deal in his days in Toronto. Hell, he even did a Hungry Man dinner commercial. But what this picture does not show is how ingrained he truly was in the community, both as a hockey player and as a classy individual. He was beloved, no doubt, and still is, looked back upon fondly among Leafs fans to this day. Lanny's time as a Leaf is still looked back upon with great memories, and many wonder as to why he's not one of the many honored players on that team's history in the Raptors. These accomplishments speak for themselves. He was an asset that they took for granted. And that does it for part 1 of our look at the career of the great Lanny McDonald. And to give a bit of a spoiler for the next video, his time in Colorado does not last very long. We cover his 1 full season with the team, and then his years in Calgary. That's next time. Please like, subscribe, comment on which players you'd like to see me cover in the future. Until next time, I'll see ya.